Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this discussion, looking at the U.S.-Turkey relations and what future lies ahead. We are, as you all know, at the beginning of October, there was, let's say, diplomatic mini crisis, should we say, which is in the process of being resolved over the visa issuance in Turkey, to which Turkey also responded in kind, and both countries are not issuing visas to each other, non-immigrant visas in those countries. You can get those visas in another country, in a third country, but right now that's not being done as it's usually done. And if I'm sure most of you know the background to this, the Gülen investigation, coup investigations ended up, Turkish judiciary ended up arresting U.S. consular personnel, and the U.S. diplomatic corps, the State Department responded to this by suspending issuance of non-immigrant visas inside Turkey. But discussions are ongoing, and there seems to be some progress, and we are hearing that it could be resolved soon. But this is obviously just another, as I said, mini crisis perhaps. Hopefully it's a mini crisis. But there are many other concerns and disagreements and points of contention between the U.S. and Turkey, and most of them are not new, as you know. Despite the new administration, the new Trump administration. So we would like to discuss these issues, but with an eye towards the future and what might happen. Of course, talking about the future in these times when both capitals have serious political issues to deal with, as well as military issues on the ground. Nevertheless, we still hope to end up on a positive note today, looking to the future of the U.S.-Turkey relations. So today we have 3 panelists. One of them is running late. He'll be joining us soon, hopefully. To my left, Richard Outzen. He's the senior U.S. Army advisor and member of policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State. He has a distinguished military career. He worked at the National Defense University before. He taught courses on strategy and the Middle East. He served in Kabul, in Jerusalem. He served in Turkey. So you can read his bio in the bio sheet. And then to his left, we have Dr. Kilic Kanat. He's our research director, and he's also an assistant professor of political science at Penn State University. As I always forget to introduce myself, I'm Kadir Ustun. I'm the executive director here at SETA. So I just want to turn to my panelists for their introductory remarks, and we start with Rich. Thanks for coming to this discussion, Rich. Please.
Okay, thank you, Kadir.
Thank you.
And it's a great honor to be here at SETA. Thank you for inviting me to come. A number of years I've been working with your scholars and analysts, and I appreciate it every time. It's a great honor to be here with Kilic, who is also a good friend and a fellow student of the American-Turkish relationship of some standing, and General Kimmitt, who will be with us shortly, who is actually was a former boss of mine previously when I was working in OSD policy. I want to point out today I'm not here representing either the United States Army or the State Department. I'm here in a personal capacity because I've been following U.S.-Turkish relations since roughly 1990. As my very first assignment in the U.S. Army was in Turkey, working with the Turkish military. And I've been able to do that on several occasions since. And of course, have also spent a significant amount of time in other parts of the region, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, and a couple other countries. So it is always fascinating. It is never a boring topic whenever we sit down to talk about U.S.-Turkish relationship. And today, I have a guardedly optimistic message. That's hard to be an optimist about U.S.-Turkish relations, but I take that challenge on freely. First of all, I want to discuss a little bit of the historical context about it, and second, a little bit about structural challenges in the relationship, and then third, I want to follow up a little bit talking about kind of maybe where we can get some progress looking forward. Before I talk about the structural issues, let's talk about history. This has never been an easy or an enthusiastic bilateral relationship. There's been times when we sort of forget the problems and we start to talk in glowing terms. And frankly, it's very easy for Americans who have served in Turkey or Turks who have lived in the United States to get enthusiastic about it, because the peoples at a popular level are kind and sympathetic and hospitable. And certainly Turkish hospitality I've benefited from many times. But we come from very different political cultures and very different strategic cultures. And that's always been the case. And I can tell you in 1990, the first time I went to Turkey, there was tension in different parts of Turkey then related to Turkish politics that I could sense immediately. And it never manifested as an overtly personal anti-Americanism, but it was very clear that the Turkish society was not one, and nor the Turkish state, that was overjoyed about having U.S. forces in Turkey. We were there as part of the Cold War. This was just before 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was a very good, very valuable strategic cooperation, but it still bristled. It was still not a particularly popular presence at that time, which is one of the reasons it was so easy to draw down the American forces significantly after 1991. Ironically, that also reduced the number of Americans who got to know Turkey in a very personal way. I was one of those people who came to know Turks in a way that gets beyond some of the stereotypes and also some of the political problems. There's been times of great mutual commitment and common struggle in Korea, the Cold War, Balkans, Somalia. Those are well known. And there's also been recurring periods of deep mistrust and deep skepticism about one another. Cyprus, of course, in the 60s and the 70s stands out as one of those issues that raised popular temperature against one another to a very high pitch. And of course, we still haven't hit in the current period anything like what we had in 74 and 75, when after the Turkish operation in Cyprus, U.S. Congress cut off all provision of military, an embargo on military supplies to Turkey, and Turkey in exchange invited or disinvited all the U.S. military forces that were there, except for a very small group that was associated with NATO. There have been, let me just read a quote actually from a book that's a couple years old now, but a detailed study, this is Alexander Cooley's work called Base Politics, Democratic Change in the U.S. Military Overseas. A detailed study of social conditions of U.S. troops in Turkey in the 1960s found that U.S. personnel and dependents routinely faced hostile demonstrations, poor community relations, and legal problems. Port calls by the Sixth Fleet became tense and violent affairs in 1968 and 69, as some U.S. sailors were attacked by groups of radicalized Turkish students while on shore, prompting Turkish right-wing groups to clash with anti-American demonstrators during U.S. visits. After 1975, in a move that would have been unthinkable 15 years earlier, the Turkish government suspended all military activity by the U.S. except for NATO-related Incirlik missions. The government declared the 1969 Defense Cooperation Agreement and all other bilateral defense treaties had lost their legal validity, and that all bases in Turkey used by the U.S. would be turned over to the full control and supervision of the Turkish armed forces. The action curtailed U.S. military activities throughout the country. U.S. operations remained suspended until the Carter administration negotiated a solution in '78. That's 3 years of ruptured military relations. So we just need to keep this as context. And there were also political or terror-related assassinations of Americans in Turkey. Some of that happened while I was in Turkey in the 90s. Dev Sol, I think, was the group that was doing most of those. There were also assassinations of Turks in the United States by Asala and by other groups. So it's true that today we have very negative press coverage in both countries. We have difficult diplomatic relationships. We have several very difficult differences of policy that are complicating and in some cases preventing regional cooperation. There's no reason, though, to think that the bad blood and misaligned policies that are currently prevailing will fundamentally shift the geopolitics of what brought us together in the first place. They have created and sustained common interest and mutual sustainment before. So there are a number of things that are good for the United States and good for Turkey in a geopolitical sense. And I think that's going to continue to drive us to seek stability for Turkey and areas of regional cooperation. Well, it sounds overly optimistic, but again, we've been through very bad times before. Let's talk real briefly about what I see as the two major structural problems in the relationship, because there are also sort of temporal or what I consider temporary problems. The first structural problem I would refer to as kind of the coup/Gulen complex of issues. To many on the Turkish side, this appears primarily as a matter of security. The Turks believe that the Gulen movement developed a parallel chain of command within the security services and the other organs of state, that this parallel organization initiated and formed the backbone of the 2015 failed coup attempt, and that it's inconceivable that the leader of the broader movement did not know of this and approve of this. And given that perspective, the failures of the United States to either extradite Gulen himself or to entirely endorse the causal argument about the coup strike many Turks as not what an ally should do. From the U.S. perspective, though, it looks a little different. From the U.S. perspective, this is largely a matter of democratic norms. Many Americans look at what happened as absolutely criminal, violent, negative coup attempt that should be punished within the bounds of law. But from the American perspective, how that justice is administered matters every bit as much and perhaps more than whether the justice is actually administered. So the difficulties and worries about the suspension of rights and about due process weigh very, very heavily in the minds of American observers. So this is what we might call a classic wicked problem, when even people who follow this very closely have a hard time defining the problem together. So that's one of the structural issues. State of emergency, the arrests and detentions, the trials, the restrictions on press and civil society, the consolidation of presidential power are all seen as very consequential on the American side, where I think it's from the Turkish perspective, these are largely seen as subordinate to the security aspects of it. And that's just different, again, political and strategic cultures looking at it. The other half of the structural problem is what we might call the PKK-Syria complex of issues. To the Turkish side, this looks very clean-cut as an attempt to destabilize and weaken Turkey by arming a group with ties of ideology and organization to a foreign terrorist organization that's recognized even by the United States. The justification from the side that says that the SDF, YPG, PYD is operational, tactical, and temporary is not particularly convincing to the Turkish side. To many American observers, the role of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in fighting ISIS is not only useful but actually admirable. And the Turkish focus on the links seems like missing the major point, which is that the focus should be on the defeat of ISIS. Again, I'm not arguing that one side should adopt the other side's vision or understanding of this, but when you have such a fundamentally different set of starting points and perspectives on that with these very visceral issues, it's going to drive the tenor and the tone of relations into a very bad direction. So that's the bad news. We have two deeply seated and deeply felt misalignments that don't seem like they're going to change anytime soon because the legal processes following the failed coup will play out for some time. And similarly, the stabilization of Syria and the enduring defeat of ISIS will play out over time. And yet, that doesn't change, again, what we need from one another in the broadest sense. We do need over time to work through these structural issues. But what we really need is to reestablish an understanding of a community of both interests and of values. And those values include the fact that it's terribly important for the United States to have both a stable and secure, but also a democratic and Western-oriented Turkey. And resuming the dialogue on that on every level that we can is critically important. But again, I don't think that's insurmountable. It's just something that we need to focus on. And we've been focused on other things. The other thing is that in geopolitical terms, neither one of us wants to see an Iranian-dominated Middle East. Neither one of us wants to see Syria break into pieces. We both ultimately want to see a return to a functional, integrated Syrian state, not led by Bashar al-Assad. There's a lot to work with there. Now, there's some significant barriers to how we get to a unified policy on that. But I think we should remember that, generally speaking, our regional interests really are aligned. Now, I'll finish just by saying that there's a couple of things we can focus on right now. The military-to-military relations are still working. I know the U.S. military has good relationships at the mill-to-mill level, even when the political-to-political level is a little bit tight. Where we need to put more focus on is economy to economy. There are so much room for arrangements on free trade and arrangements on, and I'm not an expert on those agreements, but there's more we can do to move in that direction, to have some targeted agreements between the two sides. And I think that will be a focus of our politicians. How do we increase the volume of bilateral trade, and how do we have some, so for instance, the sale of Boeing jets to Turkish Airlines, a significant sale that was recently announced, is one of the few bright spots that stands out as really good news. If we can manage these two very difficult structural problems and get them on a better place in the medium term, and we can get some good news stories generated in terms of both the economic side and the people-to-people side, which does require issuing one another visas, so I do hope we get through that as well, then I think that there's every reason to think that the temporary and periodic tensions in the relationship, which are at a very high pitch right now, I think we have to admit, will recede as they have in the past. The fundamentals of the relationship are good. And I think I'll look forward to hearing the other speakers and also to getting your questions later. But that's really my message, which is essentially an optimistic one, realistic about the nature of the very troubling difficulties we face in the relationship right now, but a long-term optimism about where this goes.
Thank you very much, Rich. Kilic.
Just a few words, and Rich basically summarized the history and the current major issues. Couple things, since actually the end of the Cold War, we are having, as Rich mentioned, the roller coaster relations between Turkey and United States, and partly it is as a result of the uncertainty and unclear nature of the alliance relationship between countries. And the problem was not about only Turkey and United States, and United States got this problem with each and every ally about defining the nature of the relation. What is the alliance in the new post-Cold War world? What is the alignment? And what should be the different options to consolidate these new alliances and defining the new alliance systems? So the problem about Turkey-US relation was Turkey is located in a region which there are extensive amount of international conflict, and the same problem, the same type of mistrust or let's say skepticism in regards to the relation between the allies also present in different countries. US-Poland relation had that, passed through that, and US traditional allies today, when people mention traditional allies, one of the biggest problems is mistrust, the question about US commitment, etc. So US may be right about, especially after 2008, that the nature of the alliance system needs to change, that this is basically, it is too costly, it is something that US cannot handle at this point, but there should be a clear definition of what burden sharing is, what is expected from the allies at this point, because the alliances are usually and mostly, they have to be bigger than basically the sum needs to be bigger than the parts. Otherwise, it would be a transactional partnership, and it wouldn't create a identity of an alliance system or an alignment in itself. So there should be in terms of identity, what you mentioned, in terms of giving an identity for the alliance, there should be a new definition, new description. And unfortunately, what we have been seeing so far is there have been good points in the relation, and when you look at those good points, the great moments of the relation, you will see that when the chemistry between the two leaders of the countries match and when they can communicate better, that is considered as the best times of the relation. However, those communications doesn't bring a significant strategic output that will consolidate or strengthen the nature of the alliance system. So what we are having is constantly changing names, enduring partnership, strategic partnership, model partnership, and each and every one of those conceptualization or wording basically fails to fulfill the expectation of both countries, because there is not an infrastructure and recognition of the lack of infrastructure at this point to improve the relationship. So that the uncertainty and problem about the clarification of the alliance system. What are we expecting? Because when we are discussing this, we shouldn't discuss this, forgetting the context of an evolution of international system and increasing destabilization in Middle East. So if we talk about Turkey-US relation in the absence of that context, we will miss most of the points. The second issue is about the YPG, of course. And YPG, the real question is, Kadir and me we were giving a talk a couple days ago, and one of the and the ordinary audience from the audience, an ordinary person stand up and ask why US is doing this to us. What did we do to US, right? The question is, there is this kind of, especially in terms of YPG, there is this frustration, and PKK issue is something that unites all Turks across the board. And what we are seeing is, especially with the US assistance to YPG, at the public level, we are having a serious mistrust and serious concern. And there are multiple different questions. So United States is trying to give all possible guarantees, saying that YPG will not attack to Turkey, YPG will kind of, take the arms back, the weapons back. But there are a lot of questions. The questions include why US is trusting YPG. Is there a secret agreement or negotiation? Because it is not clear what will happen after Raqqa to YPG. So if the relation is temporary, tactical, and limited, what does that mean? And is the United States aware that this temporary tactical relation is kind of destroying or harming long-term strategic partnership with Turkey at the same time? So these are the questions that not at the policy level, but the public level, whenever you talk with the Turkish ordinary citizen, they keep asking this. And at the public level, skipping the parts that Rich mentioned, at the public level, there is a serious mistrust. And this is a negative attitude towards the United States in Turkey. And it has been since 2003, since US invasion of Iraq, there is this constant talk about anti-Americanism in Turkey. But this anti-Americanism has not been what US is. It was about what US does or does not in the region. So why US is invading Iraq, or why US is not doing anything about Syria. And this has not been, I think, handled very well by the US side. It's also, the blame also falls on the part of Turkey, maybe, about the other dimension of it in Turkish image in US. But what has been happening is to have pictures with PKK personnel in Syria and post that on Twitter. This is a public relations disaster. And it shouldn't be happening. Everybody knows what is happening in northern Syria, and everybody is considering up to that point that this is temporary. But when you started to give those pictures, or when you started to make those statements, like the supporting YPG verbally on Twitter, that creates the public reaction for this. And this is the most politicized part of the world, probably. This is the part of the world which, in the prime time, the most favorite programs are the news shows and the talking heads. So this is something that everybody pays attention to, ordinary people, policymakers, and at this point, public is very attentive about what US is saying. We went to Turkey-Syria border multiple times to have a research about the Syrian refugees. You have to see that those people, in the villages, are aware of the red line statement of President Obama. They are kind of, want to make political statement. So this is a very politicized part of the world. And any kind of public relation disasters such as that puts the policymakers also under strong pressure about their relation with the United States. And I should stop at this point. And
well, we have our third panelist, General Kimmitt. He's currently an advisor to U.S. firms in the Middle East. He's running his consultancy, but in the past he has a, again, distinguished military career. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy under Secretaries Rumsfeld and Gates, and also as Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs under Secretary Rice in the George W. Bush administration. And I'm not going to read the extensive biography, but General Kimmitt, sorry for the problem on my part. I should apologize. There was a confusion. But anyway, the Lieutenant Outzen was talking about, Colonel Outzen, sorry, was talking about YPG issue and the Gülen issue as the sort of structural, ongoing problems in the U.S.-Turkey relationship, and he's guessing that it's going to carry over into the future. However, there could be other issues we could work on, including economy and people-to-people relationship. Hopefully, visa issue will be resolved. And Kilic talked about the alliance systems, how the U.S. is looking at its various alliances. Just to recap what has been said so far, but please, floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, again, you and I have talked about this, and we've all talked about this before. I actually think you read the wrong part of the biography. Probably the part of the biography that is most applicable and I'm most proud of is my time in NATO and my time in Bosnia. In Bosnia, I was a brigade commander, and there was this other gentleman down there from the Turkish military named Hulusi Akar. I understand he's done pretty well in your system. He's still in, I'm out. That ought to talk about who was the better officer. So what I would simply say is, especially in my time at NATO, there was no doubt in my mind of the strong relationships between the two countries. I also know that the relationship between our two countries on the military side certainly predated my time in NATO, and it went back many, many years. Turkey was one of the first countries, as you know, to join the NATO alliance in putting troops on the ground in Bosnia. They've been a valued partner of ours by allowing us to use Incirlik Air Base for years and years, from where we ran Operation Northern Watch, and fundamentally was able from that operation to ensure that Saddam and his people were not able to attack northern Iraq, and kept that area safe until the United States came into Iraq in 2003. We'll talk perhaps about the last couple of weeks, but that's a different story entirely. So let's stipulate up front that the challenge we have between our two countries is not a structural long-term problem. It is a temporary problem that I think we've got to rely on the two countries to work out. And I think the most important thing that the United States can say to our colleagues and our friends in Egypt is, trust us. I know that's hard. I know that's difficult to say, easy to say from up here. I'm no longer in the government. I know how difficult that is to demonstrate that to the government of Turkey and its people. I do agree with you that what we have here is not a structural policy, long-term structural policy problem, but we do have a significant near-term public relations problem between our two countries. We also have the issue, obviously, with FETA and Fethullah Gulen. We've asked you to be patient with us as the extradition process goes through the legal hurdles, just as I would suspect the government of Turkey would ask us to be patient if you were, and candidly have recently sought to detain some either American employees or American citizens inside your country. On the issue in the very near term, obviously, I can't sit up here and say that we are going to solve the YPG problem tomorrow. I am here to say, as consistent with American policy, that relationship is temporary, that relationship is tactical. And if we've learned nothing else since last month, our relationship with the Kurds is not blinded by a unstoppable policy and a reflexive policy that says everything that Erbil does, we support. obviously, in the referendum. We were very, very clear that, as was Turkey, and I'm glad to see we were on the same side, we were also luckily on the same side as the Iranians for once, and Baghdad as well, in terms of the referendum. But the fact that we made it very, very clear to the Kurds, our long allies, who have much, very much, are in the debt of the United States through Operation Northern Watch since 2003, that they were unwilling to assist us in that slight demand to delay the referendum. Well, they should not be surprised what happened consequently when the Iraqi troops retook federal land and they appealed to the United States, and the United States said, you know, they're working constitutionally. I bring that up primarily because there are some beliefs in the region in general and the United States in particular that we will reflexively stand behind our allies in every and all cases. That's simply not the truth. So when we say we will stand behind the YPG, but it will be temporary and tactical, I hope you will take us at our words. We also, as we said, and I'm sure you've already discussed, so I don't need to go over it, the challenges that our two countries have with regards to Fethullah Gulen. And there are other issues, one of which that if we don't have the visa problem resolved by February, mine is going to run out. I will have a new passport, but I will not be able to come through Istanbul as I normally do. So the only words I can say on this issue with the government of Turkey is have patience with us, take us at our words that this is not part of a monolithic conspiracy to undermine either the government of Turkey or our long-standing relationship with the Turkish people, and time will tell whether we live up to our words, and I'm confident that we will do so.
Thank you, General. Rich, prior to the discussion, we started trying to solve that problem, YPG problem, over there. How do you see potential points of cooperation? Okay, there's one view, we were talking about this. Okay, we're done with ISIS, more or less. This has to stop, or others discuss, you know, the support for YPG. Others say, well, we need to scale it back and we need to not basically hand them over to Russia or Iran, or we need to ensure that that area stays out of ISIS's comeback or reach. Of course, for Turkey, that relationship, a continuation of the relationship with the US is a major problem. So how would you and I be, or the rest of the panel obviously couldn't resolve it now. How about we try to do that now?
Well, there's no reason to think that what it has taken the governments of the United States and several of its allies 6 years to complicate and make into a big knot, that the four of us will be able to untie in 30 minutes or so. But I think there are some useful things, or observations maybe, that we can draw. The first is that I agree with the general. When we say temporary and tactical, we mean that. And I want to assure everybody on the panel and the audience that there is no grand plan that involves destabilizing Turkey that's not in the United States' interest. There is no grand plan to take territory from Iraq or Syria or any other regional country and to create something else out of it. That's simply not something we would do, and it's not in the plan. And in terms of the relationship specifically with, and I think words matter here, so the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, a component of which has been drawn from the YPG, which is related to the PYD as a political movement, and the broader movement of which the PKK is also sort of a core part. And it's very clear why our Turkish friends would be concerned about that tactical and temporary relationship. And I think that has sunk in. Americans have, because initially 2014, 2015, the focus on ISIS was so razor sharp, because this is unprecedented. that a group would do the gruesome and inhumane things that they did. And frankly, because they were attacking the United States, American citizens and people here, that got the attention of our system, our policy system, in a way that very few things can. So I think people understand a little bit on the U.S. side how we became so focused on getting implements into place where we could attack ISIS directly. That was a temporary problem. It related to the existence of the physical caliphate of ISIS. We are rapidly approaching the end of that physical caliphate. On the other hand, I think Americans over the last couple of years have really become much more attuned to what this means for Turkey, and just how threatening and how negative in terms of long-term implications that would be if it were not a temporary and tactical relationship. But policy in democracies does not always work in a smooth, comprehensive, cyclical manner. It works in fits and starts. So there was a series of policy decisions made focused on the destruction of ISIS. What I can tell you now is that there are a series of policy discussions going on about how we make this right in the medium and long term. If the four of us were to sit there and lay out a path that will meet Turkey's minimums and the United States minimums and the other regional partners, I think we could get there. But it's going to take a while, and it's going to take, frankly, relationships and conversations based on trust, which have been damaged lately. So we need to work at fixing those elements of trust, getting over the visa issue, working through what we need to on that between the two countries, and then having some hard conversations about what we want to see, for instance, in Syria in 3 years. Once Turkey understands that the United States wants to see a return to a unified Syrian state, but not under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad, that will establish a certain set of possibilities. What I would like to shift the conversation from the relationship between the United States and YPG to the relationship between both Turkey and the United States with the Kurds of Syria. Because it's not a one-for-one. It's not the same to say, because as the general knows, Erbil is not Kobani, is not Diyarbakir, is not Suleimania. The Kurdish situation, the Kurdish reality in these different places differs. And for instance, the tremendous act of statesmanship that Turkey engaged in over the course of the 90s and the aughts to establish a functioning relationship with the KRG in Iraq was unthinkable. If you looked at, say, in the 85, 86, 87 timeframe, people would have said that's not going to happen. There are possibilities and political evolutions that can occur that would allow us both to get what we need out of that. And I think that's what we need to think of. And I don't think if there's a fear on the Turkish side among the public or the policymakers that there's sort of some deep-seated sympathy ideologically or a desire to harm Turkey in this process, please know that is not the case. We're just working through very complicated geography, demography, and history in that area. But I think ultimately we're going to align on it.
Just
Kilic.
adding, so at this juncture, what I think would help a lot is a clarification of a policy. So what is the perception, at least, from that part of the world about U.S. policy in Syria at this point is operation or tactics are shaping the policy, and they're driving the strategy. So in the absence of a strategy, we started to see that from Kobani, it was tactical, limited, then it went to Tel Abyad, Haseke, then it went to Münbic, then it went to Raqqa, and each and every juncture it was tactical and limited. So if there was a clear kind of statement of US policy on Syria, and if there was a clarification, I think that would help more than anything to see that, because strategies are necessary for countries to know each other as well. It is not only a roadmap for a country along the way. It also helps the allies to see the perspective, long-term plan or long-term vision of that country about the region. And in the absence of that statement, this kind of, you would call it conspiracy, you would call it rumors, you would call it concerns or skepticism, whatever you want to call, will continue, unfortunately.
If I can just follow up with one thing. In New York in September, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Secretary Tillerson, my boss, made a statement. He had a group of like-minded countries, of which Turkey was a very important member, along with 15 or 16 other states and organizations. And he laid out a vision for Syria. And I think that Turkey was on board with that. Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu was there, as were most of the allies. And now a statement about how to turn that common vision into actions on the ground is taken a little while to articulate, but it will be coming soon. And I think that is Again, this is hard because there's a lot of people affected by how we move forward there.
Sure.
But I don't think there's a lot of distance between what we all want in the end. And so I think you'll hear a clarifying statement in the very near future that lays out some of those things in common between Turkey, the United States, and the other like-minded countries.
Yeah, especially now everybody knows that alliance systems are not international free public goods. So everybody needs to contribute, everybody needs to share the burden. But at least to clarify those points would be helpful.
General.
Yeah, obviously I can't speak for American policy because I'm no longer in government. I'll defer to my colleague from state to do that. But I think we have actually put out some policies, even though we've not explicitly jumped on the table and jumped up and down. Number one, a unified Syria. And a unified Syria means Syria. We are not redrawing geographical boundaries. That was the message we had with the recent issue in Iraq, and I feel very, very comfortable that that's our policy in Syria as well. And even if, rather than have a unified Syria, if it became a confederation, I've never heard anybody in the United States government stand up and say, and that will include a rump Kurdistan or a Syria Kurdistan along the Turkish border. And we're pretty open about our policy statements. We don't do this in a star chamber behind in a cloakroom. Again, I will let somebody from the U.S. government say it, but I feel very comfortable that in the post-ISIS period, there will have to be some deployments of troops, redeployment of troops from different organizations. But I don't think that I would be absolutely floored if any of those were to allow a buffer between Syria and Turkey occupied by any representative of any form of the Kurdistan government. No redrawn boundaries. Temporary and tactical, that's a policy. A unified Syria, that's policy. A continued aspiration for long-term strategic partnership with Turkey, that's policy. So I think, and strategy. So I think that's there, and I haven't been yelled at by the State Department yet, so while they may not ratify it, they certainly haven't disputed it. But you asked a very interesting question. What are some near-term confidence measures that can be discussed? In my mind, the best opportunity right now is what's happening in Erbil. That's an area where our two countries not only should work together, but must work together. Your country has had a long-standing relationship with Erbil and its politicians and have a very, very high degree of influence and have been, to my understanding, in the backdrop, helpful very much in the near term. But look, we also understand right now that while there may be understanding between Ankara and the United States on what's happening in northern Iraq, we're still having some challenges, particularly along the border with Turkey. Who will be occupying those border points? Will it be the Peshmerga? Will it be the Iraqi security forces? And if it's Iraqi security forces, which Iraqi security forces? And if it's with those Iraqi security forces, are they going to be sequential checkpoints, the Turkish-Iraq checkpoint, the Iraq Peshmerga checkpoint, or will it be one checkpoint, perhaps shared by both the Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces? I don't want to belittle either Erbil or Baghdad on this issue, but right now they are not thinking clearly. As all of us that have spent time in the military, in the middle of the battle, you may not be thinking as rationally as you normally would. And that's where cool heads in Ankara and cool heads in Washington, D.C., I would hope are working together to try, because they are the two most proximate actors in this. Iran probably has more influence in Sulaymaniyah, but certainly not in Erbil. So that would be, if asked, my near-term confidence-building measure between our two countries that would demonstrate that although we have some areas of dispute, in fact, we need to be working together.
This might be a good time to, since I think the General missed that, to mention that I am not here representing the State Department or the United States Army. I'm here in my personal role as someone who studied Turkey in the region.
and we appreciate that.
And I wouldn't yell at you in any case.
Well, let me ask you a question. Where are you working right now?
I'm on a panel at SETA, sir.
Well, we appreciate the viewpoints, and thanks for openness in discussing these. So I can, of course, go for another round, but the room is very crowded. So I want to take a round of questions.
Good.
And try to make sure they're answered. Please here and there and there.
Yeah, Dan Liegman, I'm a writer. Yeah, you seek to make the choices between a stable Syria and Assad, or a stable Syria and a democratic government. But is it that simple? Isn't the choice really between a stable Syria and Assad and a unstable Syria, fractured Syria, and democratic government? Isn't Syria still in the stage of development where to really unite it, it still needs a autocratic government? And won't that take years until Syrians really feel to be a united people and then progress to a democratic government?
Is it addressed to a specific person? Sure. Over there.
Thank you, Voice of America, Armenian Service. I'm Arman Tarjimanyan. I have two short questions. First, one of the first early initiatives of Obama administration was to promote Turkish-Armenia reconciliation. Do you see possibility of similar steps from Trump administration? And second, we expect the publication of the list of Russian entities that work for military and intelligence. And as we know, the regional countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, plans to purchase Russian weapons. Do you think the publication of that list and the threat of sanctions will restrict countries from purchasing Russian weapons? Thank you.
Thank you. Right there, Erica. Erica, and then David.
Pollock.
Yes.
All right. Well, hi, Erica with Americans for a Free Syria. Just wanted to build on the point that Colonel Outzen made in terms of the Iranian regional role and ways that the U.S. and Turkey could work together over that aspect. What are confidence-building measures we could do there to contain Iranian proxy forces, particularly in Syria? Roll back maybe the major 4 or 5 that are operating there.
Thanks very much. I'm Dave Pollock at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I understand quite well, based on what you've said and I've heard before, that Turkey doesn't get U.S. policy in Syria. But I don't exactly get what Turkey really wants or plans to do in Syria or with Syria, particularly with the northern belt. What is Turkey's clear plan, or is there a clear plan for how to resolve the issues of the border, the Turkish military presence in Syria, the YPG or the Kurdish people of that region, and the future of the country, and the Russian role, and all of that? I want to know what Turkey wants to see, because then, and only then, can we really resolve these issues between the two of us.
Thank you, David. I want to go one by one. I'll go for another round for sure. I won't forget you. And let's do this. Stable democratic Syria, I think, was something you mentioned, Rich. Let's start with you. That idea of, I'll just let you answer it instead of paraphrasing autocracy and democracy.
Well, autocracy hasn't led to democracy in Syria, and they've had it since 1970, a little bit earlier than that. The Assad family, not only responsible for the death of over 400,000 people since the Syrian uprising started in 2011, man's violated, and his regime have violated the conventions on the use of chemical weapons. He's gassed his own people. He's barrel bombed his own people. His father did that in Hama in 1982, and I don't mean to give an oversimplified version of the causality for why countries go into civil conflict, but what I can tell you is that this didn't start as a civil war. This started as an uprising with peaceful protests that were violently repressed by an autocratic regime. That's not the kind of autocracy that leads to democracy. As a matter of fact, this particular regime has lost legitimacy to rule. And look, nobody nobody who's responsible that's looking at this wants to see a deconstruction of the Syrian state. Nobody wants to see what played out in Libya, where there was thoughts of regime change, but then nothing on the ground to maintain order. That's not what anybody's after. But if you, sir, are asserting that under Bashar al-Assad's leadership, that something like a genuine democratic reform can unfold, I must disagree. I just don't think that's where it's headed.
I wasn't asserting that.
Yeah.
I was saying that's a historical perspective,
Yeah.
that somehow you have to go through democratic.
We have a lot of questions, but let me also talk maybe the containing Iran in Syria. How is that?
So I can't give you a playbook, and if I had really good specific ideas, I probably couldn't tell you what they are. But what I can tell you is this: that, look, there's a natural, sort of organic level of relationship between the Syrian people and the Iranians. That's nothing to be worried. I mean, there's cultural connections, there's long-term political connections. That's not what I'm talking about. I think what should concern the United States government, what should concern Israel, what should concern Turkey, many of our friends, is the presence of IRGC, is the presence of rockets and missiles that can hit our allies, is the funding and organization of proxy militias, is the sorts of destabilizing activities that those militias can do, in, not just in the Sunni communities of Syria, but also on the borders of our other allies there. So there needs to be a well thought out process that's tied to political transition and the return to functionality of a single Syrian state post-Assad. That needs to be tied to a reduction of foreign forces in Syria. And of course, the biggest, I think, thing that comes to mind there is that the Iranians, for their own reasons, have sort of flooded the field with their forces and the forces of their allies. And that remains a huge concern, because while Syria, the legitimate Syrian government that follows Assad will establish its own relationships and the right level of sort of relationship with Iran, with the people, with the economy, all that, I don't think anybody wants to see that elevated level of destabilizing influence by those malign factors. And that's something that U.S. policy needs to take seriously.
General, you talked about ending up on the same side as Iran and Baghdad in Iraq. If you have a couple comments about Iran's influence in Iraq or Syria or both. And then I want to also add that question, pose that question about Russian systems because of your NATO experience.
Yeah, let me take the second question first. I actually think the purchasing of the S-series with a 300 or beyond that, it is actually not helpful to Turkey. Doesn't mean anything to NATO. NATO still has a fairly integrated air defense system. But if we now are going to include the S-300, S-400, whatever is decided to be purchased, look at the restrictions that NATO will have to put on sharing of intelligence, sharing of information, common operating picture. So I actually think everybody understands the political reason for what is being done. What I don't think is being appreciated is the tactical harm that is being done to the NATO alliance. But I actually don't think there will be much harm done to the NATO alliance. This is really this will actually hurt Turkey far more within the NATO alliance than it will help, because of the lack of sharing. Because when you got those types of systems, it implies so much more. I'm sorry, what organization were you from? No, the young lady from
Americans for a Free Syria.
Okay.
The series.
Right. No, this larger issue, if you want me to get into Iran, it is larger than Iraq, it is larger than Syria. There's often this talk about the land bridge to the Mediterranean. Look, let's accept the status quo. There is not a land bridge to the Mediterranean. There's in fact an encirclement of the entire region by the Iranian government. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, inside of Bahrain, some relationship with Qatar, certainly a long-term relationship, although not military, with Oman, although Oman is the only country that's ever asked conventional Iranian troops to deploy into their country. So if you're in Riyadh or you're in the two holy sites, you're looking out there and you're seeing an encirclement of your region by the Iranian proxies and Iranian influence. My point would simply be, when did we wake up to this issue? This is not a new issue. This is not something, I mean, that Hezbollah has been around for quite some time. We've seen these movements quite some time. And what I'm concerned about, we may be trying to put the genie back into the bottle. I think what we've got to do is have a set of policies that don't try to, quote, push back on the malign Iranian influence. Because I have no idea what that means. Do you start, well, I can imagine what it means. I heard a very smart person say there are really three options. We can either do a very, very difficult pushback, we can just sort of accept the status quo, or maybe we can work to try to rebalance, particularly in Iraq, the influence. I think what Secretary Tillerson has done recently with the Saudis to accelerate the process that some of us have been trying to do for many, many years, which is get Baghdad back into the Arab orb, recognizing that there is, even within Iraq, there is not necessarily great comfort with the Iranian influence inside the country. The senior leader of the country has said, I don't mind Iranian influence, I will not accept Iranian interference. But let's be honest and candid. The IRGC is operating as the external force, the Quds force is operating as the external force for the Iranian Revolution and the Revolutionary Guards Corps. They are in Iraq, they are in Syria, they are in southern Lebanon, they are in Yemen, they are less so in the eastern provinces and Bahrain, but their influence is still being felt. So I think we've got to look at the larger issue between our two countries and among our allies about how do you really cope with that. And with all due respect, I don't think the answer is for State Department to just put out a blithe statement by saying, okay, you got to get the Iranian militia out of Iraq now. That's a public statement, that's not policy, and that's not operations. Mm-hmm. I don't have that answer. I certainly hope David does. And for God's sakes, I didn't realize David was here. I should be sitting in his seat, and he should be sitting up here. But
So just to clarify, are you saying that's what I said the State Department statement was?
No, not your statement.
Should I move?
No. In fact, that was a very senior member of the State Department in public said Iraq has got to throw the Iranian militias out of Iraq.
Mm-hmm. So I totally agree. Statements without underlying mechanisms are not necessarily helpful.
Kilic, this with any kind of expectation from the Trump administration about potential reconciliation with Armenia, between Armenia and Turkey, like in Obama's time.
I think it's
As someone who's written a book on Obama's Syria policy, what would you say about Turkey's Syria policy?
I think about the Armenian case, you are talking about the Clinton initiative that was signed, but it wasn't. So what happened in that initiative, they agreed at, like the first steps were taken. Turkish president sent a letter of condolences on April 24th, and they met and they agreed on certain criteria. But at the last point, Armenian side basically withdrew because of the disagreement over the declaration. So both in terms of the letter of condolences, it may be a small step, but it was a huge step considering Turkish public opinion. And even that reconciliation process with Armenia, in spite of the kind of partnership between Azerbaijan and Turkey and the continuation of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So when you look at that, Turkey took several risks, and I think it would be a gradual improvement. And in that case, the Armenian side was a little too maximalist in its approach to resolve all of the problems in one single statement, which basically statement was blocked and the reconciliation failed after that initial memorandum of understanding. So will it happen again? If Armenian side is also kind of open to any kind of dialogue, of course it can happen. But of course it takes two sides to agree on those, and it takes two sides to be ready to reconcile those differences. And in regards to Turkish policy, here is the thing. I think Turkey had a political dimension of its policy, which Assad must go, and which started, actually, when you look at those statements between United States and Turkey, both of them were August 2011. They were in coordination, and it went well after a certain point. Turkey also had a humanitarian policy, a humanitarian dimension of it. And when Turkey approached this humanitarian dimension, Turkey was saying that we need to have a no-fly zone. Then it was considered too ambitious, and US didn't accept safe zone, right? Conflict-free zone, ISIS-free zone. And none of these are basically kind of met or accepted by the US side. And now it has a military dimension as well. So when you look at that political, humanitarian, military, so it is evolving and it is increasing. And the military dimension is right now, of course, the first priority is to keep all of the terrorist group out of the Turkish border. At that, at this point, that includes YPG as well eventually, right? When you look at the Idlib operation, part of that is this kind of anti-YPG operation. So the first priority is, especially considering that between 2015 June and 2016 December, we have at least 16 terrorist attacks by ISIS and PKK. So this is a serious national security concern, which Turkey, of course, took it as a priority and took the removing of any kind of terrorist enclaves around the border. So that's the first issue. But in regards to Syria, at this point, a comprehensive, Turkey, in both its political, military, and humanitarian policies, consider one thing, that there is no unilateral, Turkish unilateral or US unilateral solution for this problem. But considering US as a major power and major actor, Turkey is basically trying to agree on US on certain dimension to have a comprehensive multilateral policy that will not only include removal of Assad, but also consider the day after. Because of that, most of the Syrian opposition groups working in Turkey was focusing on what will be the day after Assad. Yeah. So I think this is, at this point, due to uncertainty in the US side, unfortunately, yes, US has a policy, but what Turks are seeing in Turkey is there's this interagency issue saying that, the CENTCOM is thinking this way and State Department is thinking different way. And this is not only being discussed in Washington, D.C. If you go to Ankara, everybody is talking about this because the messages that is coming from the US side are mixed and confusing at certain points. And it may have something to do with this new administration. Because of that, Turkey was overly optimistic with Trump because they thought, okay, at this point, the administration will change and this interagency problem will kind of, end at certain point, but it is also going on. So Turkey has a policy, but Turkey is willing to basically adopt a policy after negotiation with its allies and an agreement with the United States.
General, you wanted to add
very
something?
quickly. I actually would say that the differences between the interagency actors is actually a healthy sign rather than an unhealthy sign, because at the end of the day, this will be brought to the National Security Council and the President, and there will be a decision made, and everybody will fall in line. I just wanted to go back to the gentleman's first comment about the two choices, which I think are two false choices, very simply because if we are going to allow Assad to stay in for the sake of stability or allow instability for the sake of democracy, then we're not doing our homework. We've got to come up with something much better than those two options that you suggested. Because I think we walked away from Libya after the bombing started, and that's why we see what's happening inside Libya. I was happy to see that both the European Union and NATO and the United States of America together went into Bosnia-Herzegovina when that place was a charnel house. Is it a perfect democracy today? Absolutely not. Is it a heck of a lot better than it used to be? Yes. Is that the solution for Syria? I don't know. But there we had the same false choice. The dictatorship of Milosevic for the sake of stability, or instability between the ethnic groups in particular for the sake of democracy. No, we chose to stay in there, work hard in a multilateral manner, and bring something better to what former Yugoslavia looked like in 1993.
Thank you. I want to take two more there. Right there. And then Alan. Yes. It's working, don't worry.
My name is Safi Hamid. I'm with the Center for Egyptian-American Relations. And I think the second speaker said something about the impact of the decision of George W. invading Iraq, its ramification on Turkey itself. Throughout the history, of course, leaders do make decisions, sometimes miscalculated, sometimes poor, but they go and another leaders come. My question actually from both, from the State Department side, or Defense Department side, or from the Turkish side, should this poor decision by one leader stay in the history, scarring the relationship forever and ever? What would be the best to actually heal this kind of wounds so we can go on? Because we can see, for instance, the Iranians, they still remember 1954, and they probably will.
Okay. Alan?
I wanted to test a little the credibility of the temporary and tactical pledge. Kilic said the Turks are skeptical, and I have to admit, I don't find it completely convincing either. So I want to see perhaps General Kimmitt, I'll ask you since you're not currently in government, you could somewhat put my mind at ease on this issue. First of all, where we are now working with the Kurds in northwest Syria, won't that remain an important strategic area? And I thought, maybe I misunderstood, but I thought even you indicated we may want to have some kind of ongoing presence there. Who would we be working with, if not the YPG? Second of all, if you could put yourself in the place of the leadership of the YPG, well, I know that's a lot to ask, whether it's in Kandil or wherever it is, how would you react? What would you start to do if you became convinced that the U.S. relationship is simply temporary and tactical, as it's been pledged? And Kilic, I just wanted to ask you, could you, Turkey it seems has not wanted to have any kind of major troop presence in northwest Syria. And of course, Turkey declined when the U.S. requested to go to Kobani. And I just wondered, could you imagine a time when Turkish forces could replace, in effect, the YPG as the U.S. partner in northwest Syria?
Thank you. One more here, please. Right here.
Thank you. I have 2 points. And the first is about the U.S.-Turkey relationship. I think that limiting the conflict between Turkey and U.S. to the PYG issue and maybe Halab Golan is an oversimplification of the current challenges. I think when you look at what most of the comments that I heard seems to be one direction, what the U.S. did wrong. I think if you look at what happened in Turkey recently, it seems like the country completely pivoted, from the U.S. and the West towards Russia, militarily, politically, in Syria, on so many fronts, in Iran, Iraq. At least that requires some clarifications. That's the first point. And the second point, and to basically the comment about Syria, that the U.S. has no interest in deconstructing the Syrian state and the Syrian government, I don't know what you're talking about. I think the Syrian state is already deconstructed. If you look at what's happening in the ground, and if you look, the so-called regime is controlling just about 50% of the country, and that 50% of the country is actually under the control of fragmented militia that is controlled completely by Iran and some of it by Russia. So I don't know what that statement means. And if we don't realize that this is the situation, then I think stability in Syria is very far away. And I don't know what the U.S. plan for that is.
Okay, let's start with this last one, Rich. Syria is already deconstructed, they're saying.
Well, you give me the hard ones, don't you? There's a lot of truth in what you say.
You're closer.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. First of all, let me address the oversimplification. I think that's right. There are a lot of issues between us right now. I focused on the two that I considered structural, in that there's a lot of sort of policy and geopolitics that went into getting us to where we're at. I mean, you have to study each of those things that I identified, which is the coup/Gulen complex of issues and the PKK/Syria set of issues. Those were both baking for 5, 10, 15 years as areas where we were slowly diverging in policy from one another. And even to Turkish observers, for instance, these were not readily obvious that they were going to break a certain way. So when I look at a problem that was 10 or 12 years in the making, I think it's going to take some time to solve that, which is why I identify it as structural. And I take the General's point. That doesn't mean it's built in and impossible to change. I think it's just going to take some time to change it. Students of, so as to your other point about a pivot, students of the long scope of Turkish history, and as Kadir knows, I like to talk about, going back to the Gökturks and the Seljuks and before. The geography alone that Turkey and other Turkish states before it have occupied has always been a middle position. It's always been surrounded by larger civilizations, and some of them friends, some of them competitors. It's always had sort of an adjustment mechanism. People smarter than me have written books about how within Turkey today, there's sort of a four-way reaction mechanism. You have Atlanticists and Westernizers, you have Eurasianists, you have sort of an Islamic trend, and then there's sort of an autarkic and in-looking trend. And depending on where Turkey's threats and challenges are coming in at any time, because each of those trends has sort of a domestic constituency, thinkers who think that that's the right identity for Turkey, it adjusts. So for someone like me who wants Turkey to be a Western country, at least to lend, to sort of tend that way, I see this as a competition. I see it as a competition to support the elements within the Turkish political culture that tend to be more Atlanticist and more Westernized. And by the way, to go back to my previous historical example, when there were people, seeking Americans to beat up in the 70s, it wasn't always, Islamists and conservatives were not necessarily the ones that were anti-American. In some cases, they were saying, no, the Americans are our friends. And so I would say left and right don't matter on this regard. This is really a matter of sort of finding common cause. And I think Turkey in its many ideological sort of distributions over the years has been both anti-American at certain times and less, I don't want to say anti-American, we'll say less pro-American and more pro-American, or tending towards the Atlanticist. I think what has happened in Syria, especially since 2011, badly distorted this relationship. And because of our imperative to destroy this group that was directly targeting us and cutting off the heads of hostages and things like that, drove us to such a direct intervention in a way that crossed some very important Turkish sensitivities. But for reasons of our own that were very valid, we caused this reaction to go even deeper towards a sort of a Eurasianist skepticism of the relationship with America, and to some extent we can say perhaps there's a political Islam degree there too. I don't think those are permanent. And I don't think Turkey has fundamentally reoriented. I think Turkey is adjusting as it always does. And I think it's incumbent upon those Americans and Turks who think that that's an important relationship, who think Turkey in NATO and a strong Turkish-U.S. relationship is critically important for both countries, and I'm one of those, to try to get back to the set of factors that pulls Turkey back to the West to position of trust. And that's why, so I totally get your point. There's a lot of evidence to support it. But with the way that I view the structure, I just think that that's not a foregone conclusion. And in terms of the other part about deconstructing Syrian state, massive damage to the state, absolutely. What I really was referring to is that how carefully do we plan what comes after? And I think the General was mentioning that as well. And I would assert that both in the case of Iraq in 2003 and in Libya in, was it 2011, we did not pay sufficient attention to the arrangements for what would come after. So yes, I didn't mean to imply that we think that there's still a fully functional Syrian state left. That's not the case. There's going to have to be a lot of partnership and a lot of international support to construct good arrangements that comes after. And it takes me back to the point we had about Assad. I don't think he's the right guy to be presiding over that. But I take your point, and I don't mean to minimize the damage that's already been done. It will be a massive and long-term process to wicker that all back together.
Kilic, let me go to you about this maybe pivot question, if you want to address it at all. And then, because Turkey cooperates with Russia Iran to some extent through the Astana process in Syria, and then back to that Turkish troops in northwest Syria question, those two.
About the pivot question, since, like it has been a while now, since 2003 actually, whenever Turkey improved its relations with Iran or Russia at that time, mostly economically, what we see is a shift of access. Turkey is turning away from the West, those kind of debates. And this is coming and going since 2003. And as Rich rightfully mentioned, it is basically, it's not, I wouldn't say it competition, but there is strategic priorities of Turkey as well. And about relations with Russia, we know that a very significant, the weakest link in Turkish-American relation is the strongest link between Turkey and Russia. It's economy, right? It's fossil fuel energy dependence, basically. And with Iran as well. So, and these are Turkey's neighbors. So it is not something that United States from the other side of the Atlantic, it's a different geography than Turkey is having. And when you are talking about Turkey's geography, you have to consider that we have one failed state, one kind of Iraq, right? It's kind of in middle, Iran, Armenia, and Russia. So this is the geography that Turkey is taking place. And basically, to improve the relations and to keep the relations with its neighbors at best level is some kind of priority. And I don't see a pivoting, but I see that the attitude towards United States, at the public level, in 2003, until 2013, 10 years, it was what US was doing or not doing in other parts of the Middle East. It was about Iraq war, it was about Abu Ghraib prison. This is the public level, not policy level maybe. But starting from 2013-14, we started to see that the attitude, the source of the attitude is mostly about things that related to Turkish national security and national interest. And of course, this is a different type of attitude. It is still, as I said, it is not something totally ideological. It is not about what US is. It's about what US does or does not. It's a different type of attitude towards United States, but it is there and it needs to be handled. And as we mentioned in the introduction, the public diplomacy will play a significant role to resolve that. And I don't want to mention names, but yes, like the interagency competition is healthy and it is necessary. But I was mentioning in my first remarks about the tweets about certain people and the perception of the Turkish people about that. That will not help Turkish-American relations at this point. And the perception would be, of course, that's kind of deep skepticism at least public level. But of course, at the policy level, NATO, this strong alignment of Turkey towards NATO. And there is questions, I had get these questions that will Turkey, basically pull out from NATO. I don't think it will ever happen, right? It is a significant source of Turkish strategic leverage in Middle East and in different parts of the world as well. So that's out of question, maybe. Kadir is looking at me, so I'll finish. Yeah, and about the 2003, the first question about the 2003. It is not about 2003. The 2003 crisis was not about the Iraq crisis. It was the Houthi incident, which in 2007, two countries signed a memorandum of understanding about a strategic vision in Turkish-American relations. Foreign ministers signed the deal, and it was going well. And even immediately after the Houthi incident, Turkey and United States started to work together about at least intelligence on PKK and other issues. So this is important, and this is not something that the crisis that we keep remembering the bad parts of the relation, but it was something very definitive. And when you talk in this town about the CENTCOM's most the tendency to support YPG, I heard from some experts saying that, hey, CENTCOM doesn't trust Turkey because 2030 Turkey didn't pass that resolution to launch Turkish troops from the Turkish soil, right? So it is kind of, you may accept it or not, but that's a talking point that many people mention, but it is not one of the crises that Turkey and United States had. And in regards to Alan's question, I think the key here is in both the Kobani issue, the question was, will there be a unilateral Turkish military intervention? And at that point, when Turkey offered, okay, let's intervene, but all the countries in international coalition should chip in terms of combat units, right? In terms of combat troops. And most of the countries didn't do, right? So at the Euphrates Shield was basically as a, like the last resort to do that. And then, like at that last resort, Turkey did something unilateral. And however, I don't expect that in the long term, if that threat doesn't exist or emerge again, there will be any kind of, a significant push towards unilateral intervention.
I think, if I understood it correctly, Alan was trying to say instead of U.S. working with YPG, can it work with Turkey in northwest Syria, where?
Okay, we don't know if it is, how it went with policy level. You know that there was some kind of offers before the Raqqa operation about Turkish troops together with U.S. troops or Turkish supported.
FSA.
Yes, FSA troops. Trained by Turkey.
Were sufficiently trained.
Yeah, even they discussed the passage through the YPG held territories towards Raqqa, and it wasn't accepted by the U.S. And as you may recall, in our meetings here, several people mentioned that we made multiple different offers, actually present options, and none of them were at that point was regarded kind of acceptable by the U.S.
General, this tactical temporary not convincing, that was one question, and then there was a question about the legacy of Iraq's invasion still having an impact on the U.S. relationship, and anything else you might want to add.
No, I'll just make it very quick. Look, Alan, as Hillary Clinton once said, what was the comment about strains a willing suspension of disbelief. However, I think at this point, the American policy may be simply as short as trust me. At this point, we have made the policy statements, and now we just got to, as you would say, not just say it, but live up to it. I agree. On the issue of the fundamental question about post-ISIS Syria, look, we've got a long way to go to that. We do know it's going to be an international solution. It can't simply be Turkey. It can't simply be Syria. It can't simply be the United States. We're going to see something of the order of Dayton or the Vance-Owen peace plan, or I am less concerned that the international community will come up with a reasonable solution. I am more concerned that the international community will have the long-term patience to execute that solution and stick with it when Syria, 5 years, gets subsumed by another crisis. And when it comes to Iraq, I at this point, after so many years, I don't necessarily want to discuss what some would say was the original sin of Iraq, which was the invasion of the United States. I find that to be that's for the historians. Policy is about looking forward. We'll let the historians look backward. I think that conventional wisdom has already made their judgment, and I don't think I'm going to change anybody's mind in the last 3 minutes here.
Okay, with that, I'm going to close this session. We can continue the conversation afterwards. Please join me in thanking the panel.
You have a way of